I'd like to talk to you about the evangelism. In many ways, I feel like this is our biggest contribution. The let me first of all tell you something about who we have in the church. On the first page, look at the under demographics and profiles on page 16. You notice, by the way, something about where it says Manhattan. This is a religious preference, not the population, not the macro people groups. Where it says Manhattan, a mid-'90s New York Magazine survey of singles in Manhattan determined that 40% said that they're Catholic. That was their religious preference. 6% said they were Protestant, as opposed to compared to 60% nationally. 21% said they were Jewish, compared to 2.5% nationally. 33% said they were none or something else, compared to 12% nationally. And by the way, it's one of the things I noticed is if you were raised Catholic and now you don't believe a thing, you still say you're Catholic on a religious preference. If you're raised Jewish and you don't believe a thing, you'll still say you were Jewish. If you were raised Protestant of some sort and now you don't believe anything, you'll say none. Because the Catholic and Jewish identity was an ethnic identity as well as a religious preference. So it is a very, very secular place, but the most interesting thing is only 6% of the folks say they're Protestant, which is amazingly small. Smaller than California, smaller than the Northwest, Pacific Northwest even. Now, I mentioned that just to give you a little bit of a breakdown, who are the people groups? Even though we basically have professional people, there are 8. And by the way, these are overlapping. You have to understand they're overlapping. They're not 8 separate groups, but they're 8 ways of graphing them, just to help you get a little better idea of who they are. We have our creative established class. These are people who are in the arts, editing, the media, academy, cultural institutions, and they've made it. They've made it. That is, they're there, they're permanently living there, they're doing well, and they're not as wealthy in general. They may just be, for example, if you're a musician and you're a trumpet player for the New York Philharmonic and that's your job, you're an established creative professional. There you are. You may not be super wealthy, but there you are. Corporate established class are people who have made it in the financial world, business or law, and they're very well off. Then you have your young urban professionals, and these are both creative and corporate people who are trying to make it. And generally speaking, they're there for 2 to 7 years trying to make it, and they either make it enough so they can go home with a New York City thing on their resume, or they stay at it long enough until they realize they're not going to make it and they go and do something else. It's very typical for artists and actors to do that. Stick at it until they feel like I'm probably not going to be able to stay here. And then you have college and grad students. Now, that's one way to break them down. And as you see, at least at Redeemer, it's 10% creative established, 10% corporate established, 60% of the younger people trying to make it, and about 20% are graduate students and undergraduate students. There's another way to break it down. These are 4 other rather large groups. Asian American second generation, about a third of them of which are Chinese and about 2/3 of which are Korean. Jewish professionals, I've already mentioned them. They're the most likely Anglo people to be, if you want, to have been born and raised and live in Manhattan. If I meet a white person who was born and raised and still lives in Manhattan, not always, but ordinarily they're Jewish. Then you have borough natives. Now, borough natives are, generally speaking, these are folks, usually they've been raised in working class families, and they're the first generation to go to college, and they can be Irish or Italian, or they can be black or Latino, and very often they're longtime New Yorkers, and they either move into the city for the first time, and they kind of get away from their working class roots. And then you have gay people. Now, by that, just to give you some idea about that would be, this is probably a guesstimate. When I took the first 200 people, the way Presbyterians do it is when someone joins the church, you go before the elders. But when the church was new, I was the bishop. I was a Presbyterian bishop. There was no elders. It was an interesting experience. And I personally interviewed and brought in 200 members. There was 110 women and 90 men. And I didn't ask anybody. I didn't ask anybody about this, but 18 of the men volunteered to me that they were attracted to the same sex. Now that's 20%. And I didn't even ask. These are the 20% that volunteered. And they understood what Christianity taught. They understood that they were being called to not practice homosexuality. And so that's, that wasn't a problem issue, but it's an interesting statistic, because I'm pretty sure that when I look out there on Sunday, and knowing what I know of Manhattan, that roughly speaking, that's still the case. About 20% of the people there are attracted to the same sex, is my guess. Which also, along with being a very large number of Asian Americans, a very large number of Jewish people, that's probably also a fairly large number of people to be in an evangelical church who have same-sex attraction. So we might be number one there too. I just don't know. Turn over to page 17. I'm trying to give you a snapshot of the evangelism history, and then try to tell you what we do. But first, let's tell you what's happening. Near the bottom, of page 17, I mentioned these are three statistics that I can't vouch for anymore. In the first 7 or 8 years, we really tried very hard. It's very hard to... we're a Presbyterian church, for example, which means if you were baptized anything ever before in an Orthodox church, so if you were baptized Catholic as an infant, you were baptized as Episcopalian, if you were baptized in a Southern Baptist church when you were 10, and if you say, I've just received Christ, I did not understand Christianity, I've given my life to Christ, we don't baptize them because we don't do it that way. Which means we would just receive them as a reaffirmation or a transfer or something like that, which means that you can't look at, there's no one spot where I can look at some nice set of statistics and see how many people have become Christians at Redeemer and have joined the church. So what we used to do is, in the first early days, is to try to keep track of it, because we realized something special was happening. We used to try to keep our own count as elders. And 6 or 7 years ago, we stopped doing it. But here's what I can tell you from the earlier days, is that, to our surprise, 25 to 30% of the people on Sunday were consciously non-believers. That is to say, they knew they didn't believe, but there they were. 25 to 30%. We know that because we used to actually, when the church had 20 or 30 or 40, 200, 300 or 400 people, and if you did an awful lot of pastoral work, you could tell. You could look out there and count. We also discovered that about a quarter of the people at least were non-Christians there every Sunday. The second thing we discovered was there was another third of the attenders who were Christians who were unchurched, but they're only coming to Redeemer because of Redeemer, but they hadn't been going to church for a long time. So that meant we were something like 55, 60% of the people who were coming were either non-Christians or unchurched. And the other thing we recognized was we would try to keep a count, but about 100 people became Christians every year. I mean, I have often heard churches talk about how many baptisms they have, but don't forget, when you have a Baptistic church baptizes anybody who hasn't been immersed before, and I don't think that that's a very good way of judging, frankly, by looking at the baptism statistics and really telling. So under the most conservative estimates, the first 5 or 6 years, 100 people became Christians every year at Redeemer, and at least a third of them joined the church. But a lot of them didn't, for various reasons you could ask me about. I won't tell you now. If you turn over to page 18, before I tell you what we did, let me just say that I find that it's misleading for me to go and say, here's how we do evangelism, as if the methods or the things we do produce the converts in some kind of one-to-one relationship. I don't believe it. One of the reasons why, I read a PhD dissertation on Willow Creek, and I know that this isn't what they say, but this is what the guy said. He said his surveys indicated that only about 29%, 25 to 29% of the people in their weekend seeker services are non-Christians. That's what he discovered. He says 75% were Christians, 25% were non-Christians. Interesting question. We are not seeker services. These are worship services. We have a confession of sin. We have an organ. We sing hymns, at least in the morning services, which are the bigger ones, actually. They're not secret services. How in the world do all that number of non-Christians come week after week? That's a big question. How did that happen? And we also we don't have any evangelistic small groups. We don't have any evangelistic program at all. And I'll get to that in a second. But I believe that the number one reason why we've seen so many conversions is because it is, humanly speaking, I'll say this slowly, carefully because I'm a Calvinist, humanly speaking, it is far easier to do evangelism in the cities than in the suburbs. I would never want to go back to a normal place and try to do evangelism again. I am utterly spoiled. And let me give you a couple of reasons why. It is, humanly speaking, okay, it is vastly easier to get a non-Christian into a worship service in the city than it is somewhere else. Take a look. You see where it says urban dynamics in the middle of page 18? Number one, I'll give you 3 reasons. Number one, you realize that a single Christian asking a single non-Christian to come to church is about 5 to 10 times more likely to get them than a Christian family inviting an entire non-Christian family to come to church. Because if any member of that non-Christian family doesn't want to go, if the parents want to go but the kids don't, if the father wants to go, the father wants to go but the mother doesn't, they don't go. So first of all, it is vastly easier to get singles to come out to a non-Christian singles to come to a church service than it is to get a whole non-Christian family to come. Vastly easier. But secondly, and I'm not trying to pick on anybody, is the suburbs pull people apart. So, for example, you do not work near the people you live with, and you do not live with the people you work with. See, now, so for example, you live in the suburbs, you commute into some place pretty far away, and there's all the people that you work with, but where do they live? They live all over the place. So if you work in Manhattan, but you live in New Jersey, but you're working with people who live in Long Island, you work with people who are living in Connecticut, they're all over the place. Then you go back to New Jersey and you look at your neighbors, and none of those people work anywhere near where you work. So, in fact, they're so busy that on the weekends they're usually gone. Let's just say, though, you're a young lawyer in Manhattan, and you are working with a bunch of other young lawyers who also live in Manhattan. What do? They don't have a commute. What do they do after work? They go out and they eat together. There are lawyer watering holes, and banker watering holes, and cop watering holes. In other words, if you don't commute, then you actually live near the people you work with, and you work with the people you live near, which means the suburbs pull people apart and the city pushes people together. And especially the city pushes Christians together with non-Christians. It's vastly easier to get to know your neighbors. You have to get to know your neighbors in apartment buildings. I'm sorry. You just have to. In a way, you do not have to get to know your neighbors on the street, in a suburb. So I had no idea about this. I had never really lived in a city before. I had no idea how much easier it is for Christians to build bridges to non-Christian friends in cities than in the suburbs. Unbelievably easier. Thirdly, cities are places of change and pressure. People who are living in cities are going through constant changes all the time. There's turmoil. Cities are like college campuses on steroids. Everybody lives in dorms. There's gathering places. People want to talk about the meaning of life. And it's very different. I was absolutely shocked at how the urban dynamic... Now, by the way, it's far harder to do discipleship in the city. But it is, humanly speaking, but it's far easier to do evangelism. Far easier, and I never want to go back. I never want to leave. Now, there was one other thing, and I have to get to... Dave down here had asked me a question, and I wanted to get to this. There's something else that happened, and this is urban as well, that I mentioned at the bottom of page 18 and top of page 19. This is it. Another thing about cities, when I first got to Redeemer and started preaching, I found that afterwards people would come up to say something to me. Out in the suburbs, people were not as gregarious, not as direct, middle class, emotional control and communicative indirectness and so on. But that's not true in New York. It's not true of New York Jewish people. It's not true of the artists. It's just not true of New Yorkers. Even if you've been there for a while, it rubs off on you. I'm not sure where it came from. But what happened was after the services, people would come up and say, I want to talk to you about what you said, and I want to see you sometime this week. So I probably saw 30 people at least every week, at least half of which were non-Christians. The non-Christians were offended by things I said. They wanted to talk to me about it. In Virginia, If somebody had brought a non-Christian to church and they didn't like what the preacher said, they just sort of slip out the back, or maybe they just shake my hand at the door, but not a New Yorker. The New Yorker said, I was offended by what you said, and I want to talk to you about it. So I had now, this is informal, it wasn't formal, but have you heard of focus groups? What happened to me every single week was I had, and boy, I learned a lot, because the people that showed up were people I had never, I'd only read about, these kinds of people. And they came and they told me what offended them, what excited them, what helped them, what made them weep. I was just getting this enormous amount of feedback like I'd never gotten in my life before. That cannot help but affect you, because you sit down to work on your text. Now, this is, let me boil down this whole issue of contextualization for you. Maybe you have been perplexed by it. Let me boil it down. Let me tell you what contextualization is. You get only the answers from the Bible to the questions you've asked. Different people, different temperaments, different races, different cultures, and different centuries tend to ask the Bible different kinds of questions. This is the reason why, by the way, my old friend Harvey Kahn used to say how silly it was to ask Koreans to adopt the Westminster Confession of Faith. You know why he used to say that was silly? He said, well, for example, one of the things Koreans needed more than anything else was to address the issue of ancestor worship and how do you treat your parents and your ancestors. And there's not a thing in the Westminster Confession about it. In fact, even when you get to the stuff on the commandment about honoring your father and mother, it downplays the family aspect and talks about obeying the civil magistrate. And Harvey says, is there nothing in the Bible about parents? Is there nothing about ancestors? Is there nothing? No, he says the point is that the Scottish and British people in the 17th century, when they were writing it, it wasn't in their mind. It just wasn't in their mind. So when they were reading, because the question wasn't in their mind, they read through all these texts and it just didn't occur to them. Contextualization basically is getting answers to the Bible to the questions you ask. And because of your context changes, your questions change. So it's not like you're reading things into the Bible, you're seeing things you didn't see before. And when I had my head ringing with both the questions and the concerns of non-Christians in New York City and the Christians, in my head, ringing, and then I would sit down to study the Bible, and suddenly a text that I preached on, in Hopewell, Virginia for 10 years, I preached Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. 3 sermons a week, because that's the way it was done. I left Gordon-Conwell. It took me 2 weeks to write a sermon. I'd only preached twice in my life, and it took me 2 weeks to write a sermon. So I got down there, and they said, you have to preach Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. I said, okay, let me see. 2 weeks to write a sermon, 3 sermons a week. 2 weeks. That's impossible. It can't be done, but I did it. And what it meant was that I had to preach through everything. I almost ran out of Bible in 10 years. So when I got to New York, every time I was preaching on a text, I always had some sermon I had already preached on, in Virginia. But my ears were ringing with the things that the people were saying about what their needs were and their issues were and their concerns were. I would look at the same text, and I just saw stuff that I'd never seen before, because I said, oh, this is exactly what this person was talking about. This is exactly what this person needs to hear. And when I say it was all kinds of stuff, I sat down with a woman once who said, look, I went to, I have an Ivy League graduate, and I'm a prostitute. I work for an escort service that guarantees wealthy men they will get a prostitute who has a bona fide Ivy League degree. You have to prove that you went to one of the Ivy League schools. You have to prove it. And she says, very simple. She says, I make $700 a night. This is back in 1989. And she says, I'm an artist. It's the only way I can make my living. And she says, half the time they don't want sex. And she said, the reason I am interested in Christianity was because I feel this emptiness inside. So the most interesting thing about being a church planter in Manhattan is you had to sit there and not look astounded. You had to sit there and say, oh, really? Then run home to your wife and say, oh my gosh. But, you can't have a conversation like that and sit down with the woman at the well and see it the same way. For example, I think it's perfectly fair to say this. I think it's exegetically sound. She says to Jesus, give me this water that you talk about. This water that if I drink it, I will never thirst again. Give me this water. What's the next thing he says, class? What's the next thing he says? Anybody remember? He says, go get your husband. Now, is that a non sequitur? Was he just changing the subject? He says, I don't have a husband. No, you're right. You've had a lot of trouble with men. She says, give me this spiritual water that this water. She doesn't know what he's talking about. She just thinks it's miraculous water. Give me this water you've got. Why does he ask about men? Is he changing the subject? No, what he's trying to say is, this is what you've been trying to get out of men, and you can't get it. You can't get it, but I've got what you've been trying to get out of them. Now, I never understood that text very well until I'd spent some time with some people like her. I don't think I was reading anything into it at all. I can back it up with exegesis. I can back it up with the best commentators. But I didn't get it either. Now, I completely had to rewrite every single sermon when I thought about the kind of non-Christians who were sitting out there, with their heart in their hand waiting to hear. Just totally changed. Totally changed the way I preached. Now, that happened, and that's an urban dynamic. It wouldn't have happened in Virginia. It didn't happen in Virginia. Those kinds of people did not come. They weren't brought, and they didn't talk to me. So, where's the brilliant? You see what I mean? If I didn't spend that time, you say, well, how did all those non-Christians show up? We have no evangelistic programs. We still don't have any evangelistic programs, so I'd like to change that a little bit. I'll tell you about that in a second. But basically, it was the urban dynamics that made us an evangelistic church. It was an urban dynamics that made me an evangelistic preacher. Now, you could say, was God working through the urban dynamics? Obviously. Now, having said all that, let me give you 3 basic things that I'd like to say have contributed to the evangelistic effectiveness of the church. 3 things. The first is what I call the texture of evangelism. The second is what I call the message, the basic message that we use. And the third one is about apologetics. They're all in here, but I'm just going to take you through. The first is I'd like to tell you something about the texture of evangelism. The second is let me give you a basic message that we use at Redeemer that seems to connect with postmodern people. And then lastly, tell you something about apologetics in this situation. And try to do it in about 15 minutes so we have a lot of time to answer questions. I'm not tired yet, so why should you be? Now, you're just sitting there. What I mean by texture. On page 19, I want to read you this paragraph. Very important, I think. We are asked what our model of evangelism is. The question basically comes to me all the time. What are your programs? What's your model? The question basically seeks to learn about the program. Now, the newer programs for evangelism, which are great, are programs like the Alpha Course, which is a very, very good program, or even Willow Creek Seeker Services, or those outreach services where you have drama and you have a concert and you have a talk for non-Christians. Those are the newer approaches to evangelistic programs. The older approaches to evangelistic programs that I came up on in the 70s were things like evangelism explosion, visitation evangelism, or even evangelistic speakers. I came in on the end of the mass evangelism era, where you brought a visiting evangelist into town and people brought their friends and so forth. Now, that's what I mean by programs and models. So when people look at Redeemer, they're looking for a model and they're looking for a program. However, as I already mentioned, at one point we knew, when we had about 100 small groups, we did a little survey and found that there was at least a non-Christian in every group, if not more. And we also have said we have at least as many non-Christians in the worship services as Willow Creek does in their seeker services. But we do not have seeker services, we do not have evangelistic small groups, and not only that, there's not anybody on staff whose job it is to do evangelism. We've got a pretty large staff. There's not a single person that comes even close to doing evangelism. They're all doing nurture and pastoring and that sort of thing. So what gives? Well, my answer is, what I try to say here, I think, and this is where maybe Redeemer it can be a help to other people, evangelism is a texture to everything we do. It's not a slice of the pie. It's the texture of the whole pie. It's worked through every single part. It works through I'm trying to say that if the worship, the small groups, the outreach ministry, the holistic ministry of the poor, education, the community, they all have an evangelistic texture to them. So I'll use the term missional. I know everybody's doing it now, but I would say you don't need evangelism programs. You need to have a missional form to your entire church. A missional form to your entire church. What do I mean by that? Well, let's turn over. That was 19. This must be 20. Oh, look in the middle of the page. Michael Wolff, I told you about this quote. You see the sort of the top third of the page. There's a italicized quote. Do we all see it? You're kind of looking. This is where Michael Wolff says, there's a fundamental schism in, there's a fundamental schism in this whole country. There's the people who say schism, and there's the people who say schism. And how can we live together? There's a fundamental schism in American cultural, political, and economic life. There's the quicker growing, economically vibrant, moral relativistic, urban-oriented, culturally adventuresome, sexually polymorphous, and ethnically diverse nation. And then there's the small-town, nuclear family, religiously oriented, white-centric other America with its diminishing cultural and economic force. By the way, you know what? This was actually an article about Fox News. And he was talking about the fact that Fox News appeals to the second nation. And he was actually trying to say 20 years from now, that nation won't be big enough to make Fox News first. That's an interesting, I don't know. But he's right about the fact that you have these two nations. The problem is that evangelism, here's what I think is going wrong. Most churches, without knowing it, by their jokes, by their lingo, by their jargon, have created enclaves where already conservative traditional people feel at home. But if you actually bring somebody from the other nation in, they are immediately turned off or confused. So you have to create little incubators outside. You have to create alpha programs. You have to create places or seeker services or postmodern services where people can come in and sort of into the church but not come all the way into the center, because there they'll be turned off. I suggest that is short-sighted. Because very often, I know of some of you do too, I know of quite a number of churches that have smacked alpha programs onto the rest of their ministry without changing the way the ministry happens on the whole. Some people become Christians in the alpha program, they come on into the church and they say, wait a minute, it's almost like a bait and switch. It's like I got sold something and now the church isn't anything like that. What you really have to have is a church that is, the whole church is an incubator. Every small group is an incubator for non-Christians. Every worship service is an incubator for non-Christians. Every volunteer program working with the needy is an incubator for non-Christians. You know why? Because non-Christians today need process. They make their decision to become a Christian through a bunch of little decisions. Let me show you on the top of page 20. Here, let me give you an example. A person today doesn't become a Christian by saying, I think I'll become a Christian. Are you on page 20? Okay. People here's awareness decisions. This, like, for example, when the non-Christian looks at the person next and says, hey, she's okay. She's not so bad. She's cheerful and accepting. That's the first decision on the way to becoming a Christian.
You're on page 21. Just a little awareness thing.
It is. Now, wait a minute. 16, 17, 18, 19. Right. You're right. Actually, I wasn't really doubting you, but I just needed to see it for myself. See, I couldn't take it. It's an epistemology thing. I couldn't take it on your word. All right. Could you all turn to page 21? I'm sorry. You become a Christian through all these little decisions. The first decision is for a non-Christian to look at a Christian and say, she's really okay. That's the beginning. She's religious, but surprisingly open-minded. That's another one. You can be a Christian and have more than a third-grade education. Here's one at the end of a sermon. The Bible's not quite as hard to understand as I thought. See, what are these things? These are many decisions. How do they happen? They happen over a period of time. And therefore, non-Christians are not going to be able to, I don't believe non-Christians can come to Christ even in an incubator that's 10 weeks long like this Alpha program. Listen, in India, how long does it take a Hindu to become a Christian? In 10 weeks? Don't you realize increasingly that's the distance between what's happening inside and outside? You have got to create incubators so that non-Christians can come in and see worship and see fellowship and see community, but at the same time see it in a way that's lucid and a way that's sort of palatable and a way that's coherent and maybe even a way that's persuasive. And you've got to make your whole church like that. See how easy this is? Not slap on a program. Now, by the way, let's face it, I'm making a case for church planting. I think it's very hard to take a church to this situation, and therefore I don't want anybody. As I was saying to a couple of you before, my first church was a renewal, 10 years in Virginia. And I'm very glad I couldn't probably do this with my I probably never could have gotten my church to that spot. This is the sort of thing that I think would probably be something that is easier to do with a brand new church, but maybe not completely. So you judge. Let me just tell you how you do it. But this is different than a program. It's a texture. So look at the bottom of page 21, as you have pointed out. Let me give you 4 or 5 things that you have to do if you're going to make your whole church missional. Number 1 is discourse in the vernacular. I know it says 2, but trust me. Discourse in the vernacular, all right? When we lived in Christendom, that is to say, when we lived in a society where people were not getting converted by society, but the society stigmatized non-Christian behaviors and beliefs. So that's the way America was. Non-Christian behaviors and beliefs were stigmatized, so that there was there was some Christianization that happened in a society, so by the time you got them in church, they knew something. You know, it was your job to call them to commitment and to conversion, but at least they learned something. That's just not true anymore. And what that means is when people come on in, it's like Hindus coming into a Christian church. They're a long way off, and that means these 3 things. First, the missional church does not avoid the use of biblical terminology, but takes enormous pains to explain things. Enormous pains to work with people without theological backgrounds. Very important. Number 2. By the way, this is still the bottom of page 21. Don't turn over just yet. Sorry. You see where I am? Yeah, okay. Secondly, the missional church avoids ever talking as if non-believing people are not present. You never act like they're not there. You never talk about them and us. Never say that. We and them. Don't talk like that. Because they're there, hopefully, at least if you're doing this right. In other words, you need to be overheard. Every sermon is to be overheard. Every conversation is to be overheard. If you know somebody's listening to you talking, doesn't that change the way in which you talk? You know, you're talking to party 1, but you know party 3 is listening to you talk. That affects you. You're taking party 3. Party 1 is your main communicative object. But party 3 is still there, and you don't want them to be misled, or you don't want them to be misunderstanding, so you might change your language a little bit. And that's what you have to do. It's extremely important to think of it like that. You have to imagine you're always being overheard. And that's extremely important because non-Christian people today tend to try on Christianity. One of the things that I learned some years ago in the early days of Redeemer was sometimes people acted like they were already Christians. When I said, "So you've become a Christian?" They said, "Oh, no, I haven't." "Well, you sound like you're becoming a Christian." "Well, I'm thinking about it." What they would do is that in the Bible study or in the study, they would talk like they were, but you know what they were doing? They were like trying a dress on. They hadn't bought it yet, but they wanted to see what they looked like in it. And they were just saying, "Well, how would this work for me?" So they are very pragmatic, and the only way that happens is if you bring them on in and act like they're there and talk in such a way that they can understand you and never talk in a disrespectful way about their doubts and about their fears. Now you can turn over, I'm sorry, page 22. And the church avoids tribal language. Now here's what I mean by that. Stylized evangelical jargon, archaic language that seeks to set a spiritual tone. Prayer language. Fourth, the church avoids we-them language. I already mentioned that. Disdainful jokes about mocking people of different politics and beliefs. Dismissive, disrespectful comments about those who differ with us. And I guess that's one last thing. There's a pump. This is when I guess I was telling David Horn about this. When I first moved south, all Southern accents sounded the same to me. They all sounded uneducated. And if you don't live in Britain, all British accents sound educated. When you actually get there, you come to realize that the insiders to the culture they don't hear it that way. They hear these nuances. They hear nuances, and they can say that's an educated version of our accent, and that's an ignorant backwoods version of our accent. And they can tell, but I can't. Being the outsider, I don't care. I don't notice that. When you have to be on the inside to notice those little differences. Those little differences mean a great deal to the insider. Pomposity, sentimentality, emotionally manipulative talk, which you and I are, because we've been in the evangelical world for a long time, seems just like second nature. There's nothing wrong with it. It's stylized. And I think secular people come in and they say, what is going on? And they just are quiet about it. But there's a self-promoting way. There's a putting spin on everything. Everything's so glorious. Everything's so blessed. Everything's so wonderful. Non-Christian people today are pretty ironic. And there is a gospel irony. There is a gospel way of saying, I'm a sinner saved by grace. That's a joke. I can't take myself too seriously. There is a gentle kind of gospel irony that you have to draw on and just be joyful, not pompous. If you are having trouble following this, if you say these are a lot of distinctions without difference I don't quite understand, for people inside the secular world, there are huge differences. They tell immediately if they go to other churches. They can see, they sense the difference immediately in our church. And what we have to do is whenever new people come on staff, the minute they get up front and they start talking, my wife and I basically have to afterwards just, get them in we have to tie them up, like this, put them in a chair, put this light over them, and try to explain. I said, you don't think those things make any difference. And they don't make any difference to non-Christians, but to Christians. But to non-Christians, they make a huge difference. An absolutely huge difference. You've got to stop it. And that's a big part of what it means to make your whole church an incubator. Let's go on. I said discourse in the vernacular. Next, you have to enter and retell the culture's stories with the gospel. This is extremely important. Let me just put it into a nutshell. And I could take days to flesh it out. I won't be able to, but here it is. In order to really communicate to somebody, you have to find out what their main story is. You have to find out what is it that you think life is about. What do you think is the problem with the world? See, my parents basically believed the purpose of life was to be good, whether they were Christians or not. My kids' generation believes the purpose of life is to be free. Now, the Bible talks to both of those groups of people. You have to find the strands. But what I have to do is I have to enter the story. I have to enter the story of the person, of the culture, show it sympathy, show that I understand it. I have to start to enter the story and tell the story, but then I have to at some point show them that their story cannot have a happy ending without Jesus. Their story can't have a happy ending without Jesus. Do you know what I mean? Well, I'll tell you what. What page am I on? Somebody tell me. Enter. That's what? 22? Okay. Then turn to page maybe 24, 25, 26. Let me show you. Do you see freedom versus forgiveness gospel there? Okay, good. Let me show you what I mean by this. The basic difference between people I meet today, even in New York, by the way, because there's so many non-white people from other countries, is the difference is how and why they see they need the gospel. People from traditional cultures and mindsets tend to have a belief in God and have a strong sense of moral absolutes and obligation to be good. This may be a sense of obligation to their family, to their people, a general moral ethic, a tradition, or even a religion if they are raised in Christianity, and so on. These folks respond well to a presentation that says, sin keeps you from ever being as good as you need to be, and it therefore separates you from God. People with more secular and postmodern mindsets, however, tend to have only a vague belief in the divine at all and have little sense of moral absolutes. Therefore, they feel the obligation to be free. That's what they think life is about. That's the story of their lives, and that's what they think the story of human life is to be free and to be true to their own selves and dreams. These folks respond to a presentation that says, sin keeps you from being as free as you need to be, and therefore it enslaves and dehumanizes you. Look up here a second. I'll get away from my own text. You understand? What you have to say, all the old gospel presentations, evangelism explosion, 4 spiritual laws, steps to Christ, Billy Graham's steps to peace with God, they all assumed an older cultural story, right? Which is to say, you know you should be good, right? But you're really not good enough. But Jesus Christ can forgive you and make you good, come into your life. That's what they're all saying. That's why they have these bridges, right? I mean, you have this gap, right? And here you are, but sin is keeping you from being as good as you should be, and Jesus is the bridge over the gap. That's assuming a cultural story that my own kids' generation doesn't understand. The whole gospel presentation has entered into my parents' story and said, you know you should be good, but you're really not good enough. But through Jesus Christ, you can be forgiven and made good. But my kids are different. My kids say, you got to be free. You got to be free to be who you are. Okay? The gospel presentation has to go like this. You think you're free, but you're not really free. Because if you build your life to center on anything but God, you become a slave to that thing. This is out of Becky Pippert's book, Out of the Salt Shaker. If you live for people's approval, you're a slave to what they think. If you live for power, you're a slave to power. If you live for money, you're a slave to money. If you live for anything but God that's the source of the center of your life and your identity, only God, if you get Him, will fulfill you, and if you fail Him, will forgive you. Because if you build your life on career and you don't make it in career, that career thing will beat you to death the rest of your life, and you'll hate yourself. So you see, you define sin differently. With my parents' generation, you could define sin as breaking the rules. With my kids' generation, you have to define sin as Kierkegaard defines it, which is building your identity on anything but God. And what you have to show my kids' generation is if you build your identity on anything but God, which is idolatry, that makes you a slave to the thing that you're building your identity on. Listen, if you say to my kids' generation, sin is breaking the rules, they say, well, who's to say? That's your rules. I don't have the same rules. Right? But if you say to my kids' generation, you're building your life on something, you're building your identity and your sense of significance on something, if it's not God, you're a slave to it. And you know what? Non-Christian kids of my kids' generation say, yeah, you're right. They do say that. They do. Because what I've done is I've entered the story differently. I've entered the story, but then I have to show that only in Christ does your story, have a happy ending. You have to enter and challenge the story. You can't tell them the gospel assuming some other culture's story or some other generation's story. But at the same time, you can't just come on in and say, if you accept Jesus, then Jesus will help you, to your career goals. You have to both enter and challenge. That goes back to this whole thing about under and over adapting. If you under adapt, that means you don't even enter the story. You tell the gospel in some older form and it doesn't connect at all. But if you don't challenge at some point, if you don't challenge the particular idolatries of that generation and that culture, you're not really going to convert anybody. So what you have to do is you have to say, I see your story. This is your story. I've read your books. I've listened to your music. I've gone to your plays. I know the hopes and the fears and the aspirations. I'm completely enmeshed in your cultural story. And I want you to know that in many ways its aspirations are wonderful and good, and they're expressions of what the Bible says God put into us in our hearts, the image of God, but it'll only have a happy ending. Your story can only have a happy ending in Christ. The plot lines only resolve in Jesus Christ. Okay. Now, that's the reason why I don't do, you might say, a forgiveness gospel saying basically, you should be good, Jesus forgives you and makes you good, but you should be free, only Jesus Christ can free you. And let me point out something. Both of those approaches are biblical. I mean, sin is defined as breaking the rules, and sin is defined, as slavery. And in fact, they're both in Romans. What's interesting is, if I preach the freedom version of the gospel, if I preach sin mainly as not breaking the rules, but as taking good things and making them into ultimate things, what's interesting is I get both groups. See, if I have both traditional people and postmodern people in the same church, I get them both. Why? There's a danger with preaching sin as breaking the rules, because as we all know, Pharisees kept the rules. In other words, they understood the aspects of sin which were moral compliance to the rules, but they didn't understand self-righteousness. They didn't understand self-salvation. They didn't understand idolatry of the heart. They didn't understand the deeper issues. So if you go after the deeper issues with the freedom gospel, you get the people who also think that the purpose of life is to be good. If I use the forgiveness gospel, I don't get the people who think the purpose of life should be free. So you have to enter the story and then retell it with Jesus. Now, can you go back to, where was I? Thank you very much, Doug. Thank you very much. Let me just finish the list, and then we'll do questions. So you have to discourse in the vernacular, 22. You enter and retell the culture story of the gospel. Okay. 23, page 23. By the way, if you want an example of this, look, it's the sort of second full paragraph on page 23. For the Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Look what happened. What's he talking about? Jews seek power. Greeks seek wisdom. But to the Jews, Paul preaches Christ weakness and yet real strength. To the Greeks, he preaches Christ foolishness and yet real wisdom. What's he doing? He's both challenging and at the same time fulfilling the particular cultural stories. See? What he's saying, on the one hand, Jews, you want power, and Jesus goes to the cross, and that's weakness. But if you come to understand the gospel, you'll see it's really the power. It's the true power. It's real divine power, and it really fulfills the power that you've been looking for, but been looking for in the wrong places. To the Greeks, he comes and says, you want wisdom, and there's Jesus Christ on the cross, and that's foolishness. But if you understand the gospel, it's the real, ultimate wisdom that you have been looking for in your culture, but which you've been looking for in the wrong places. What is he doing? He's both entering and challenging. He doesn't preach Christ, the wisdom of God, to the Jews, nor does he preach Christ, the power of God, to the Gentiles. See? He preaches Christ, the weakness and the power of God, to the Jews. He preaches Christ, the foolishness and the wisdom of Christ, to the Gentiles. There it is. Now, just to hurry on. To create a missional church, though, it does not just mean you're just preaching the gospel. It means changing the whole church so it's fitting for people who are coming in from a secular environment. So, for example, when I say here, theologically trained lay people for public life and vocation, the first people that I started to see converted, they came to me, and I said, good, now you have to be discipled. Oh, good. So I would give them the classic stuff on discipleship. Next thing you know, one guy came to me and said, well, look, I'm an actor, I'm on a soap opera, and I'm also working on Broadway, and I want to know, can I take my clothes off as a Christian now, as a Christian actor? Or what parts can I take and what parts can I take as a Christian actor? And they said, where's the book on that? I was being taught how to, I gave them all this discipleship material, and they said, this is very nice for my private life. Thank you very much for showing me how to be a Christian on the weekends. But what about the rest of the time? And I had no idea. And I came to realize that the reason why our discipleship materials do not try to integrate Christianity into the way in which people do their art, or the way in which they do their business, the way in which they do their scholarship, the way in which they do their law or medicine or whatever, is because we used to have a kind of Christianizing culture out there where basically these ethical issues weren't out there. Actors didn't have to come in and say, well, what kind of parts can I take and what parts can I not? We came to realize, though it's not that easy to do this, that we have to train people for what it means to live a Christian life in the public world. And what I put down here is one of the things we had to do was really press people and say, to be a Christian and an actor is kingdom work. You mustn't get the impression that if you really, 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 really want to do something big for Jesus, you'll drop out of acting and go on staff at Redeemer. That's just we had to change our rhetoric from what they heard in other churches. We had to try as much as we possibly could to help them think through Christianly what cultural practices in their field are common grace and to be embraced, what practices are antithetical to the gospel and must be rejected, and what practices can be revised and adapted. That's hard work, and I don't know where to look. And people aren't putting out this kind of discipleship material right now. I mean, I know right here at Gordon-Conwell, there's an effort in this area in the DMIN program, and that's great. Nevertheless, unless you do this in a church today, when people come on in, even the non-Christians come in, they want to know. They want to know, if I'm a Christian, how's that going to affect my acting? How's that going to affect my music? How's that going to affect my art? Last, create Christian community which is countercultural and counterintuitive. All the stuff that Leslie Newbigin says is true. which is, it used to be that Christian fellowship was a place just for nurturing relationships, but now, in a place like New York, and I think anywhere, you have to say, we're going to show you a community which is a countercultural, alternative city to what you see out there. That is, we're going to have sex operate differently in here. It's not just that we're going to tell our single people, you can't, boy, my single people always, their eyes roll over. I said, look, the rules say you shouldn't have sex outside marriage. And of course, a lot of them are anyway. So that's a constant struggle. But I said, there's more to it than that. How is the gospel going to affect the way in which men and women relate to one another? It's very obvious that the men are refusing to marry all kinds of great women because they're not thin enough. And the women are refusing to look at a lot of men because they don't look like they make a lot of money. I mean, maybe this isn't the way it is in New England, but it's the way it is in Manhattan. And we have to look at them in the eye and say, are you letting the gospel shape the whole way in which you think about your male-female relationships, the way in which sexuality works? Then we have to go to money. Are you letting sex, money, and power? Are you letting the gospel absolutely shape the way in which you spend your money? Are you giving it away in radical proportions? Then power. Are you letting the gospel affect the way in which the races relate to each other? Are you going to stay in your own little cliques over here, or are you going to actually try to create a lot of cross-cultural and cross-racial friendships? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a community that's alternate to New York, where sex, money, and power are used in life-giving ways, not destructive ways. And non-Christians coming in have to see that. They have to see it. They have to see it's not a meat market. They have to see the way in which people use their money differently. They have to see it, or else you're not a missional community. You're not an incubator. One last thing, top of page, whatever. And then I'm done. It's critical for non-Christians to see Christians not bashing other denominations and traditions. You know why? In Christendom, when everybody was a Christian in Europe and North America, you know how you defined yourself as a church? Over against other churches. We're who we are because we're not like those churches over there. But now, that just doesn't work. Now you should be defining yourself over against the world. And whenever non-Christians start to move into a church, that they see is defining themselves not so much against the world, but against other kinds of churches. That's not an incubator. They can't stay. They won't stay. Now, look at this where it says case study for small groups. Let me read you this, and then let me show you how this goes beyond a program. I hope I'm getting this across. As we noted above, many observers wonder why there are so many small groups with non-Christians in them at Redeemer. We have lots of non-Christians in our groups. Not one of them is evangelistic, per se. But the missional church is a texture to everything. So, for example, what makes a small group missional? The missional small group is not necessarily one which is doing some kind of specific evangelism. Here's what it is. Number one, if the small group, and we talk about this to our small group leaders all the time, if its members love and talk positively about the city and neighborhood. Number two, if they speak in language that is not filled with pious, tribal, or technical terms and phrases, nor disdainful and embattled language. Number three, if in their Bible study they apply the gospel to the core concerns and stories of the people of their culture. Number four, if they're obviously interested and engaged with the literature and art and thought of the surrounding culture and can discuss it appreciatively and yet critically. Number five, if they exhibit deep concern for the poor and generosity with their money and purity and respect with regard to opposite sex and show humility toward people of other races and cultures. See this? Number six, and if they do not bash other Christians and churches. If those six things are happening in your small group, then seekers and non-believing people from the city will be invited, and they will come and they'll stay as they explore spiritual issues. If these marks are not there, those small groups will only be able to include believers or traditional Christianized people. You see that? You don't have to make the group small, evangelistic, saying, well, let's have an evangelistic small group, invite our non-Christian friends to it, and we'll study the book of John and talk to them about, why is there evil and suffering in the world. If you're able to turn the whole small group into an incubator, if it discourses in the vernacular, if it enters into the culture of the story, the cultural stories surrounding, if it doesn't bash, if it's doing all those things, if they see the way sex and money is used in the group in that way, it doesn't have to be evangelistic. It is evangelistic. You'll have non-Christians invited, they'll be fascinated, they'll incubate, they'll hear the gospel, they'll become Christians. If not, alpha programs won't help. Okay. So I think I better stop. But I think that gives you the essence of why we have basically been successful because of the city, not because we're so brilliant. But on the other hand, I think the future is missional churches, not just evangelistic programs. All right? Was that perfectly clear? Would you like me to elaborate? Questions? Yes, sir?
You had starting next Sunday back in Virginia for your mission. How would what you've learned from Manhattan change what you did the second time around in Virginia?
Well, there's two problems with the question. The one problem is, are you saying, I was 24 when I started my church in Virginia. I'm 53 now. I was an insecure person. I was scared to death of anyone ever leaving. I mean, it's much more complicated than... I know you're after method. The real problem was I just couldn't possibly do anything that ever upset anyone. I could never have anyone get unhappy and leave. I mean, now, Kathy and I say what we do with people who are really unhappy, with the way you're doing things in the church. What you do is you put your arm around and you say, what a shame you're not going to be able to stay.
How do you see the postmodern paradigm affecting suburban people?
I don't live there. I'm not sure how fast it's happening. In some ways, it's up to you. In other words, if you read this and hear this and you say, we're not where they are, you have to decide the percentage. Because I think increasingly it's coming. But I don't know what the degree it is. For example, I think in the suburbs, it's the kind of mindset I'm talking about really are only young people. In New York, it's people in their 60s and 70s are actually thinking like this, too. So, listen, I feel bad like I'm not really answering your question. Could you phrase it one more way? Give me another chance. Give me another chance. No, I think it's up to you. I don't know. In fact, I'm not even sure about Hopewell, Virginia, other than what I would probably say to my folks. I would say, here's what it would take probably to reach the younger people of the city. First of all, I have to find out whether I think is happening. If in Hopewell, everybody in the churches are now older, and virtually everybody in their 20s isn't in church, then I would actually probably ask our church to start another church and eventually and connect it so tightly that eventually what usually happens is when you start a daughter church, the daughter church reaches people that the mother church wasn't able to touch. Eventually the two affect one another. Very often some of the people from the daughter church make it into the mother church if you keep up really good relationships. Sometimes, very often, people in the mother church who are utterly against doing any kind of changes see that they work in the daughter church, and then they're willing to countenance them. And I would probably do that. What I would probably do is I would force the people of the church into being a mother church. I would really push it, and figure that what they would see happening in the daughter church would wash back in and renew the mother church. That's what I would do, probably, rather than just start a church from scratch. Yes, sir.
I'm fascinated by a lot of this stuff and thinking about how many kinds of applications this could go for. Particularly, I'm interested in reaching some of the farther out unreached people, especially Muslims and Hindus. And I'm wondering about, anyway, some of the applications I think about the whole idea of hating the city, I think applies just as well if you're going out and going into an Arab culture, for instance, and hating Arab culture or hating Islam, and you wind up just getting disenfranchised from that being attractive.
Yes,
but
that's
I'm
right.
also wondering about, as far as entering the story and then retelling the story, have you ever had any experience with entering a story in which part of that story, a large chunk of that story, is actually a other religious story?
Yeah, I have found with Jews that I say, what was all that tabernacle stuff about? What was all the sacrifices about? And very often they say, well, my rabbi told us that now we don't need that. what's all that you really need is to pray and to try to live your very, very best. And I say, so are you saying that they needed that before to have their sins forgiven, but they don't need it now? What made the change? What happened? And I usually try to press Jewish people because it's so easy. I mean, we have the Bible, which shows the New Testament says the Old Testament does not resolve. The plot lines are set up. Ray Dillard used to teach Old Testament at Westminster Seminary, said, for example, if you read the Old Testament book of Judges, you'll see over and over again, God will say, I'm going to be faithful to you no matter how you treat me. And then other times he says that if you don't obey me, I will cast you off. So he says you have unconditional statements and conditional statements almost side by side. He can show you places in Judges where God makes statements that are unconditional and say, I'm going to be your God no matter what, and other places where it says, I will cast you off if you don't obey. And Ray says, anyone reading the Old Testament has to start saying, okay, are the promises of God conditional or unconditional? And he says, unless you get to Jesus, you're going to be forced to basically choose and say they're really conditional and the unconditional statements are only apparent, which makes you a legalist. Or you can say they're really unconditional and they're really unconditional and the conditional statements are the apparent ones, and which makes you a universalist. Unless you get to the cross and see Jesus Christ fulfilling the law for us, and that's just one example of the place where all the plot lines of the Old Testament don't fulfill. I found with talking with Jewish people, it's actually fairly easy, is to say, so what do you do for your sins? And they say, we just have to, well, you're telling me the whole Old Testament, the whole temple and tabernacle stuff was just for nothing? It was just a visual aid, a prop? Really? And I've often found Jews willing to admit that the atonement thing is a problem now without a temple. And say, Jesus actually fulfills the Jewish story rather than the kind of liberal drop kick that we do today, which is to say, well, actually Yom Kippur, the whole thing was really just a symbol. We take your story more seriously than you do. That's an easy one. I haven't really worked on Hinduism. We have 80,000 Hindus living in Flushing, Queens, but I haven't been there much. But that's what you'd have to do, I think. Time for a couple more at the most. Yes, sir. You know what? Yeah, here, but I never look over here, do I? I have a problem with that. Even when I preach, I never look to my left. Somebody says it's a political thing, but anyway. I'll try my best. I'll be over to you. Yes, go ahead.
Just very quick.
Sure.
I'm just curious in terms of the vernacular, et cetera, what version of the Bible you use?
The New Inspired Version, NIV. We print the biblical passage, and you know what? I like NIV. I believe the dynamic equivalence thing, but we actually can print anything we want, and so sometimes I use a different translation. And since we don't stick it in the bottom, you don't say NIV, ESV, KJV, or anything like that. You just put it in. Nobody knows the difference, so they don't feel like they're being jerked around. But I print the scripture. I print the sermon text in the bulletin.
The reason I ask that is, a Bible like the New Living Translation doesn't use words like justification.
I know.
And I wonder if that's something you like.
Yeah, I like that translation quite a bit. I like it quite a lot. The New Living Translation, I like it quite a lot. Okay, Lefty.
I was wondering, just as far as I understand the way that you can craft the worship service to be missional for a particular target group, it sounds like it's very much one professional and kind of secularist mindset. So I was wondering just if you could speak some more to how a worship service could be missional to, for example, the poor or the immigrant population.
I'm going to ask that after lunch. I'm doing a talk on worship, and that's where you have to ask the question. By the way, though, are you asking how do you include everybody? Right. Oh yeah. Okay, ask that question. Very important question. The answer is you can't include everybody because as soon as there's what you want to do. I might as well tell you this quickly, because later on I may not be as clear. Sometimes when I'm forced to be fast, I'll be clear. As soon as I choose the English language, I've left out most of New York. Now, there's other people who have to work harder. They can understand English, but it's not their heart language. So as soon as I choose English, I know I'm moving towards somebody's cultural context, and I'm moving away from other people. Some people are going to have to work harder to get something out of my service than others. The minute I use an illustration, do I use a football illustration? Do I quote Madonna? Do I quote Foucault? Who do I quote? The minute I quote somebody, the minute I make a reference, I'm moving towards some people's context and away from other people. That is because even Jesus, people get mad at Jesus because he had to come as somebody, he had to come as a real human being. It's the scandal of particularity. He was male, not female. He was Jewish, not Gentile. He was something. You have to be something. There's no such thing as a universal, ahistorical, disembodied. As soon as I speak, I'm culturally incarnating myself. And that means immediately I'm moving towards some people and away from other people. What you want to do is you want to push against that as much as you possibly can. Ephesians 2 says, as much as possible, I'm trying to break down racial barriers and trying to show the world that the gospel breaks down barriers between people who otherwise don't get along. So in my geographical region, I want to look at the different racial ethnic groups. And if they're not different, we don't have different social classes in the Upper East Side, but we do have different ethnic groups. Good. Then let's get them together and show the world that we can get together. But I can't cart somebody in. We do not have a Hindu community in the Upper East Side. They're out in Flushing. So I can't say, now, how do I make sure that my worship service gets the Hindus in there? I'm not going to think about it because they're really not in my neighborhood. And by and large, with the poor, though we have mothers on welfare, we're so big, we have mothers on welfare. We have single mothers on welfare. We have some. But they have to work pretty hard because of the sermons. You know, I have to decide who am I going to quote, what references, what arguments am I going to make, and because single mothers on welfare don't live in my neighborhood, I don't work real hard to try to include them. I try to include the diverse groups that are in the neighborhood, so that I can show, you might say, a diverse body in a particular incarnated neighborhood. So I'm not really working that hard at including the poor, mainly because they're not there. Now, you know, in most cities, the poor are closer by. I mean, in Philadelphia, you can't find an enclave of professionals that aren't right next to a group of poor people. That's not true in Manhattan. So in some ways, I'm just not working at it. Okay? One more. Yes, sir.
Can you say a little bit more about discipleship to express frustration with the lack of materials that are available, so to train lay people, how have you addressed that? How have you developed people's thought about their career?
This is the biggest unaddressed area of our ministry. We get because it's New York, we get, you know, when we get our journalists together, we get television, you know, we have probably 15 television journalists who work for the TV stations. But when we get them together, they basically are just, I don't know what to help. I don't know how to help them. So it's going to take quite a bit of time. What they have to do is they have to show the leadership what are the ethical and what are the worldview issues that they are facing. In other words, they say, there's always the dominant discourse in any vocational field is usually coming from some worldview or a couple other worldviews beside Christianity. And it puts issues in front of them that makes them say, as a Christian, can I do this or not? So I say, give us your issues, and then we have to do theological and biblical reflection on the issues. And that's going to take a long time. We're actually right now just trying to set up a structure by which we can walk through that for the next 5 to 10 years in about 8 areas. So, you know, the visual arts and journalism and you know, the financial realm and that sort of thing. It is really a problem. I mean, we're way behind on that, and I don't know where to look at this point. The other thing I could just say, because we have to close down now, is after lunch, I never talk as much, believe it or not, because I know I've also been a listener. And after lunch, it's very hard to stay alert unless you're asking more questions. So what I will do is I'll give you 20 minutes on the worship, and then you'll have 40 minutes for questions. And if you want to, you can ask questions about this or the last or anything you've heard so far, okay? David, can I just close in prayer, or do you have to do something? Can I just do that? Yeah, just save you a little, you know, we're both older. You know, that's a long walk. Let's pray. Our Father, we thank you for we thank you for giving us the equipment that a place like Gordon-Conwell gives us. Gives us an understanding of our Christian history, an understanding of the Bible, an understanding of ancient cultures, modern cultures. We just want to be good stewards of it. We just want to be good stewards of it. We want to take the riches that we've gotten and we want to distribute them, and we want to bless people with them. And we ask that you would help us be better stewards of what you've given us because we've spent this day together. Continue to be with us. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.